Okay. Recording?
Yes, and you're unmuted, right?
Yes, I'm unmuted. Everyone can hear me, right? I assume so. If you can't hear me and you see my lips moving, you know something's wrong. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is good to be here. Good to see you all. And it's fun to be talking about pickles and fermented foods today. I am Elizabeth Coots. I am the Family and Consumer Sciences Extension Agent here in Woodford County at the Woodford County Extension Office, part of the University of Kentucky. If you are not familiar with us, we are part of the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture, Food and Environment. There is an extension office in every county in Kentucky, and I know that my food preservation classes have been advertised far and wide. So if you are watching this and you are not in Woodford County, Kentucky, but you are in Kentucky, you are welcome to visit your local cooperative extension service to find out if the Family and Consumer Sciences agent there is going to be teaching any classes, and if you would like hard copies of the publications that I have provided to you electronically, you're welcome to stop by here in Woodford County or at your local extension office and pick up the hard copies. Of course, today we are talking about pickled and fermented foods, and there is a publication from the University of Kentucky that is especially on home canning, pickled and fermented foods, which is what we're talking about today. I'm going to reach over here. I have my water on the stove and my canner just heating it up. I don't want it to be boiling yet, and we'll talk about that, but I'm just heating it up, kind of preparing. And then I have a pickling solution back here that I was stirring a minute ago, getting ready to make pickles. So what we're going to do today, we're going to go through the PowerPoint. We're going to talk specifically about pickles and some things to take into consideration when you are pickling and fermenting foods. And in between there, I'm going to be making some pickles. We're actually going to be making dilly beans today, and that is one of the recipes in your publication. So let's talk a little bit first about canning. So when we think of home canning, and particularly, you know, like today we're talking about pickles and fermented foods, but our purpose for teaching this program is to teach research-based methods. And you'll hear me say that a lot, research-based. With the Cooperative Extension Service, we are providing and distributing research-based information. And particularly with canning, that is very important to follow research-based methods and recipes. We want to make sure that you not only have a safe home canned product, but that you have a tasty home canned product. Both of those things are very important because there's a little bit of work that goes into canning. If you would, if you can, put in the chat, I'm curious to know, what is your experience with canning and what is your experience with pickling or fermenting foods? If you would just type that in the chat, just curious to see what your experience is, if you would share that with us. So let's talk a little specifically about pickled and fermented foods. So pickles, anything pickled is high acid. The acid that is added makes them this way, which the acid is usually vinegar. Usually there's a lot of vinegar in pickled and fermented foods. With foods that are fermented, the food becomes naturally fermented during the fermentation process. So if you have ever had fruit that has sat in your refrigerator or on your countertop for a long time and you smell it and it kind of smells vinegary, that food is naturally fermenting. That's, you know, we don't want that, but that is, you know, part of the fermentation process. That food is then becoming high acid because of the fermentation. And it's the food's high acid content that helps to prevent the growth of Clostridium botulinum. And you'll hear me say that again. Clostridium botulinum is the bacteria that causes the illness botulism. And you'll hear people, and maybe you have thought this before, that, you know, a lot of people will say, that's one of my fears of canning is botulism. I don't want to get botulism and I don't want to give it to anybody else. But the good news is botulism cases are very low in the United States nowadays. And part of that is because we have done research about canning, home food preservation, and people are canning in more efficient, safer ways. And it's not that difficult. Once you know what you're doing, you can do it. You too can can. But in addition to the food's high acid content, the food has to be processed in a canner. And with pickled and fermented foods, they can be safely canned in a boiling water canner. You don't have to use a pressure canner for pickles, but the canning process ensures that the food is heated completely through and that the lid forms a vacuum seal. So those three things really we need: the high acid content, the heat, so boiling water, which is 212 degrees, and then that vacuum seal, so that cooling process, which we will talk about. But those things are needed to ensure a safe product. So for any food that you are pickling or fermenting, it's important that the acid is high enough to make sure that that product is safe. But again, we don't want it to just be safe. We want it also to taste good, and we want it to be of good quality. The taste and the texture is important, as well as the safety. So there are two research-based methods acceptable for home canning: the boiling water canning method and the pressure canning method. Depends on what you're canning, which one you would use. But like I said, in this case, any food that is pickled or fermented can safely be canned in a boiling water. So let's talk just a little bit, and I apologize, that picture is very dark on the back of the screen there. It must have changed. But let's talk about types of pickles and fermented foods. And again, all of this information in this PowerPoint that I am going through today comes directly from the Home Canning Pickled and Fermented Foods publication. So you can reference that for all the information in here. Some of it I've just reworded a little differently, but it comes directly from this publication. And this information, if you have your publication, is on page, well, it's on the very first page, actually. This one is. So we have quick processed pickles or pickled vegetables. In this case, these vegetables are covered in boiling pickling liquid, pickling liquid is really just vinegar and spices. Sometimes it can be brined for several hours, and then you would drain it and cover it with pickling liquid. Brine is just water and salt. You've probably heard that with meat, and sometimes spices, but usually just water and salt. And that brining process, usually it's done in the refrigerator. It removes it, which kind of is counteractive. You soak it in water, but it removes some of the liquid in that produce, which can help with the end flavor and texture of whatever it is that you're making. And we think with quick processed pickles or pickled vegetables, we think of cucumbers the most. And that's probably what we think of when we think of any kind of pickle, is cucumber. So fermented pickles and sauerkraut. So this is when these are cured in salt and water, so brined for several weeks, which changes the texture and the flavor. It creates acid, it creates lactic acid, that fermentation process does, which increases the acidity level. And again, as we learned, that high acid is needed to help preserve the food, in addition to, of course, the canning process. And with fermented pickles and sauerkraut, we think of cucumbers, of course, and then also cabbage. Sauerkraut is cabbage, fermented. And then we have relishes. Relishes are made from vegetables and or fruits that are chopped, usually very small, and they are cooked with vinegar and seasonings. And kind of like pickles, there are recipes for sweet relish, hot relish, tangy relish, all different types of flavors. And relishes usually have a cucumber base with peppers and onions usually included. And then we have fruit pickles, and that is basically pickled fruit. It's fruit that is either whole, sliced, or cut into chunks, and it's simmered in a sweet and sour syrup made with sugar, seasonings, and vinegar. There's a lot of S's in that sentence, and sometimes with lemon juice. But with this, the most common are apples and then watermelon rind, which I've never made either of those, but I have certainly enjoyed both of those. And then the last one we have is chutney, and it's similar to a relish. So it's chopped vegetables and or fruits, cooked for much longer because it's thicker. So chutney is a lot thicker than relish, and usually it's vinegar, sugar, and spices. So a chutney is chow chow, and there's a recipe in your publication for that, but it's cucumbers and beans and peppers, cabbage, onions, carrots, tomatoes. There's a lot of stuff in chow chow, and there's a lot of chopping, in chutney. There's a lot of chopping, but it's very good. So again, and I'm going to revisit this, to ensure that your product is safe, do not change or modify your recipe, which should be a research-based recipe, the processing method, which should be a research-based processing method, or the processing time, which again, guess what that should be? Research-based. So, and we'll talk a little bit about resources later, but that's an important thing, is to make sure, if you're not sure if your recipe is researched, do a little digging and see if you know the source of that recipe. If you're ever not sure, you can always reach out to me at the extension office, and I'll be glad to help either find the source for that recipe or find a recipe that we know is research-based and safe. I'd be glad to do that. And I can't stress it enough that when we're canning, the bottom line is safety. And whether you're a first-time canner, you've never done this before, and this is all new, or you're experienced and you have canned for years, this information is helpful. And to follow these steps, again, will make sure that you are successful as you're canning. But again, and not that you have to remember this bacteria, but all of these processes and methods and recipes that are research-based is to prevent the growth of Clostridium botulinum and lots of other potentially bacteria that could potentially cause a foodborne illness. That's what we want to prevent. So it takes all of these things together to make sure that your product is safe. So let's go ahead and I'll stop sharing my PowerPoint. Well, actually, I'll keep it up, but we'll make my video a little bigger. And I am going to go ahead and start canning or the process for the dilly beans that I'm going to be making. And one thing, when I teach canning classes, there's so many different recipes. And what is in your publication here is just a few of the many, many recipes that are out there that can be safely used. So I always like to highlight the process of canning, because if you can understand and be familiar with the process of canning, chances are you can pick up any recipe and can that with confidence and with success. So I'm not going to be doing this like a food demonstration because I want you to see the process. But then again, there are some fun different recipes out there, and sometimes there are questions that come up like, oh, for example, in this recipe, it calls for 4 heads of fresh dill or 1/4 cup of dill seed. Well, I could not find any heads of dill, so I am using pieces of dill, okay? And it doesn't say pieces of dill, but it's part of the dill plant. So things like that occasionally come up. And if you ever have any questions like that, feel free to, like I said, contact me. So we're going to go through this, and then we're going to talk about more specifically about pickles. Okay, so dilly beans are just pickled green beans. So this is just a pickled vegetable. So I have over here on the stove the vinegar, water, and salt solution. So this is my pickling solution. I have simmered it for 10 minutes like the recipe says. And the next step is to pack your green beans, washed, of course, washed, clean, trimmed green beans lengthwise into your hot jars. And to keep your jars hot, well, there's a couple tips. You can put your empty jars inside your canner of boiling water. And then to keep them hot, you can set them down in just a cake pan or a baking tray of hot water. And that will help, keep your jars hot. The reason that you want them to be hot is because we have some very hot boiling water over here. Well, boiling pickling solution over here that we're going to be putting in these jars. If these jars are cold and we put very hot liquid in them, there's a chance that they could crack. So we want to make sure that our jars are hot when we put that pickling liquid in. So that's just a little tip there. So I have in here 1/4 teaspoon of cayenne pepper, a clove of garlic, a head of dill, or my dill plant pieces that I have put in there today. And optional is 1/8 teaspoon of pickle crisp. And we'll talk about that. And I'm actually not going to put the pickle crisp in my pickles. So I'm going to bring a few of my jars over here. And actually I have one here that I'm gonna pack for you. So I put in the bottom here the dill, the cayenne pepper, and the clove of garlic. So I'm just going to take my green beans, and I prefer when I'm making pickles or anything that has chunks or whole pieces of fruits or vegetables, like green beans or any kind of pickles, carrots, meat, to use the wide mouth jars. And we'll talk about that, but I think that it is much easier to get it is much easier to get the product out when you go to open that jar when you have wide mouth as opposed to the regular mouth. So I'm gonna just kind of pack all these in here. It's kind of not too tight. You don't want it to be too tight, but you want to make it snug in there. And I can already see from some of these jars that I either need to push my beans down or I'm gonna have to cut the tops of some of them off. Let's see, this one's not trimmed. Slide that in there because I know just from guessing, from looking here, that the head space, see, this one needs to be trimmed. And so I just trimmed the top of that off so that I could fit this down in there, but I'm still gonna put this little piece down in there. Now that might not win at the county fair because the pieces are not consistently the same, but it is gonna be sufficient for my pantry at home. I'm also gonna cut this one in half so that can fit down in there. So my head space on anything that's pickled is 1/2 inch. So I can just kind of guess here to see before I put my pickling liquid in that some of these beans are a little long. So I'm just going to cut them and adjust them. I'm going to bring the rest of them over here. Okay, and I'm going to bring pickling solution over here. So I can get to it a little easier. Spread that over so you can see. And when you take the lid off your pickling solution, make sure not to breathe it in because it's vinegar. And I have done that before. Okay, so I'm going to start over here. And you can use your canning funnel if you would like. You don't have to. You can certainly pour it in just with your ladle, but I think it's easier to use the canning funnel. It just gives you a little wider space. And at this point, I'm just going to kind of guess where 1/2 inch is, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to make it more precise. Okay, I'm going to get my headspace tool and I'm going to remove the bubbles, and then I'm going to check the headspace again, make sure that it is accurate. But it's easier, I think, to go ahead and fill the jars up with as much as you think is about right. And if you're not familiar with it, if you're not that familiar with what the headspace is, you could take your tool and do 1/2 inch there and just kind of get an idea of where that mark is so that you can guess. Or if you wanted to do each jar for the pickling liquid in each jar and then measure each jar's headspace, that's fine too. That's one of those things, in canning, there's definitely some things that there's a right way and there's a lot of wrong ways. But something like that, that's just kind of your preference. How do you prefer to measure your headspace? That's just what I've found is most efficient. Okay, and you'll notice this is kind of one of those things too that, on paper it looks really good, but then when you actually do it, it can be kind of hard. Some of my beans are floating a little bit, and that's okay. That happens. I'm I'm just going to try to pack them in there as well as I can. So I'm going to take the rounded end of my headspace tool, and I'll talk more about this, and I'm just going to press it down in my beans here. And I can actually feel now that these beans are a little warmer and they've probably shrunk up just a little, I can add some more green beans in there. So I'm actually going to take some out of the jar over here and just fill in some of these spaces. But be careful, because this liquid, the pickling solution that we have added, is very hot. So you can't stick your fingers down in there like you normally would.
I have a question too.
Oh yeah, go ahead with the question.
Okay. So are the jars okay to be room temperature before you pour the hot liquid into? I always worry about the jars cracking. A similar question, if the jars are warm, should the canning water be warm or can it be hotter?
Very good question. So it is okay if your jars are room temperature. You do have more of a chance of those jars breaking because you are putting very hot liquid into the jars. And the other question was about the canning water. So you want to make sure that your canning water is hot when you put your jars in. You don't want it to be boiling, just hot. Was that the question? Can it be warm? Okay. If that wasn't right, feel free to unmute and ask. I'm just going to cut another bean off here. But yeah, so I have my canner here heating up with warm water. It's warm, but you don't want it to be boiling. There's another big one in here. I'm going to cut off. Put that little piece down in there. Okay. So let's see, 1/2 inch. This one looks correct. And I'm going to kind of press those beans down in there. They tend to get unruly when you get to this point. There's a few more that can fit down in there. This one's a little long, kind of off. And I like to use, I don't know if you've noticed, but I've flipped my headspace tool around and I'm using the headspace part to press the beans down in there. Now, since I've added more beans to this, I have not enough headspace. That looks right. Okay, let me press these beans down in here. I think I can fit some more. Was there another question?
I think you just said warm jars going into hot water, not boiling in the canner.
Yes, that's correct. Yes, if that was a question, yeah, you want to make sure, because if you have cold jars and then you add hot liquid, that is a potential for breakage. And then if you put it into hot water, that's another potential for breakage. Or, if you put it into boiling water, I mean. We want to put it into hot water, but not boiling. About 180 degrees is what's recommended. Okay, got 1/2 inch on those, and it looks like this one needs a little more. So see how I'm coming back around and just adjusting, making sure that that headspace is correct. I want to make sure, and I have an image of it a little later on, but I want to make sure that the liquid and the beans basically touches the bottom of this headspace tool. And I have an image that you'll see that will explain that a little more. And I have one more jar here, and I'm going to pour the pickling solution here into the jar like this. I don't have that much left. I might be able to I have one more jar, but I'm not sure that I will have enough. And you do want to make sure, oh, maybe I will have enough. If you get to that point and you see, I'm going to run out of pickling solution, don't fill it in with just water, because then it's not going to be acidic enough. If you need, in this case, it's not recommended to double canning recipes, but in this case, you could double the pickling solution if you needed to, if you needed a little more. Okay, now I have a little too much in here. Let me pour that out a little. Imagine that jar is hot. Okay, a little too much in here too. Well, now I don't have enough. I pull this back over here. Okay. Just a little in there. Check it again. There's lots of checking and double checking. Press all those beans down. There's that one just popped right up. And that happens. Like I said, that's I think I can fit another bean in here. Maybe a couple more beans. Might be able to put another one in there. All right. Let's see now. Probably, yep, have too much liquid. We're putting the beans in. Just right. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is take a clean, damp paper towel, and I'm going to wipe the rims of my jars all the way around. The canning funnel, when you use that, really helps to keep the jar rims clean, in addition to getting the liquid into the jars. Even if you're doing something that is pieces, I always recommend using the canning funnel. It's optional, but I think it makes life a little easier. Okay, so we have our rims wiped. Now I have my flat lids here that I'm going to apply. I'm going to go ahead and put all the lids on first. These lids used to be a recommendation that you had to heat the lids in warm water before you put them on the jars. And because that plastisol underneath the lid, it's a different product, and so it doesn't need to be heated in warm water. The heat from the jar, and then once you put that in the canner, that heat will soften that plastisol and it will adhere to the jar. So that's one extra step that you don't have to do that we used to recommend. So I'm putting these screw bands on just fingertip tight. I'm not clamping them down as tight as I can, because if we do that, basically the rim of the jar could cut into that plastisol, and that could potentially cause our jars to not seal. Okay, have my water over here, and let's see, can they see that? Yeah, they should be able to.
I'm gonna switch the view.
Okay, so you should be able to see me load this into the canner. So when I put these jars in here, I'm going to make sure that I keep the jars upright at all times. Okay, I'm not going to tilt them. I want to try to, best I can, prevent anything from getting on the lid of the jar. Okay, and I'm going to try to keep a little space in between the jars as well. I'm just going to space these out in here. And I'm probably going to have one jar that isn't going to fit, so I'll have to do 2 batches. That's okay. Or I might do an experiment and try to do a refrigerator pickle with that one and see how that turns out. So I'm going to set this one over here to the side. Okay, so now I have all my jars in my canner. I'm actually going to use my headspace tool to put it down in the water and just touch the top of one of the jars and see where the water level is, because I want it to be 1 to 2 inches above the jars. And I can see the water level is right here. I know that this is 1 inch, so that's about 2 inches. So it's perfect on water level. So now I'm going to turn my heat on high, and I'm going to put my lid back on the canner. And I'm going to wait and let that boil, okay? So now let's get back to, while we're waiting on that, I'll keep an eye on it. Let's get back to our PowerPoint, and you can. Okay, so let's talk specifically about pickles. And let's see, this is on page 2 of your publication. So anything that we're canning, you want to make sure that the fruit and vegetable or meat or any ingredients that you're using are fresh, particularly in this case, fruits and vegetables. You want to make sure that there's no spoilage or damaged spots. I have a pile of some beans over here that are not quite good enough for canning. they're still edible. They just have lots of blemishes on them, but I didn't want to can them because they weren't the best of the best quality for canning purposes. Before I cut them, cut the ends off, I wash them thoroughly. You can just use cool running water to wash your fruits and vegetables. But when we think of pickling again, we think of cucumbers. They're the most common used for pickles, and it's best to use a variety that is specific for pickling. And those are called pickling cucumbers. Bigger cucumbers and just, regular like slicing or salad cucumbers, those tend to be, they tend to become a little mushy. They don't hold up as well. It's just not the best quality for canning. But with cucumbers, you want to make sure that you cut off the blossom end just a little bit, about a 1/16 of an inch, and that's the side opposite of the stem. It's usually, the blossom end is usually a little bit lighter in color. So the blossom end, even on pickling cucumbers, can cause your pickles to be soft and sometimes mushy, which nobody likes a soft, mushy pickle. So make sure to cut the blossom end off of your cucumbers. And this is the blossom end on these cucumbers here. You can see the stem at the very top, and you see how the blossom end is just a little bit lighter. Okay, so vinegar is another ingredient, and I'm using vinegar today. Of course, with anything pickled, you're gonna have vinegar, just white distilled vinegar. You wanna make sure that it is 5% acid, whether you're using white distilled vinegar or apple cider vinegar. It will say on the label, this one says reduced with water to 5% acidity, and I think this one says diluted with water to 5% acid strength. So you just want to make sure to see that 5% somewhere on the label so you know that it is the correct acid strength. And you can see here on this label that it has right underneath vinegar, 5% acidity. Don't use homemade vinegar for canning. And the reason for that is because you can't be sure of the pH level. You don't know what the acidity is. And you never want to dilute the vinegar when canning unless the recipe says so. And as long as that recipe is research-based recipe, you want to make sure that that acid level is high enough, because that's a very important part in pickling. So then we have canning or pickling salt. It usually comes in a big box or sometimes a bag, but it will say canning and pickling salt. Table salt is not recommended for any canning because it contains other ingredients, which prevents it from caking or clumping together. But table salt also can cause the brine or the liquid to become cloudy. So when it comes to canning, I always like to take any question out, any guessing out. So if you were to use table salt, that might be okay, but if your liquid became cloudy, you might question, well, is that because I used table salt, or is that because there is a harmful bacteria growing in there? Take the question out and just use the canning and pickling salt. And you can see here, or I hope you can see, this is table salt, just regular salt. And at the bottom, there are multiple ingredients in it. But on this label of just pickling salt, it's just salt. You can see that there. And that's what this is, canning and pickling salt. Other salts that are bigger crystals, like sea salts, aren't recommended either because they measure differently. And think of it like if you were to measure a cup of sugar versus a cup of sugar cubes. Okay, it's not the same amount. It doesn't equal. So if you did that with pickling, that could affect what your pickles, how they turn out in the end. And almost all other canned foods, salt is optional, and it usually will say, in the ingredients, add a half a teaspoon of salt per pint or whatever it might be. And then in parentheses, it'll say optional. But in pickling and fermenting foods, it is required for the process. So stick to the recipe and don't change the amount or type of salt. If you're making quick process or refrigerated pickles, you can safely reduce the amount of salt, but that could drastically change the flavor and the texture. So again, I always like to take the guesswork out, use canning and pickling salt, and use the amount that's in the recipe. If you're looking for a low sodium or even low sugar recipe, there are some in this publication, and you can also find some of those on, with some of the resources that we'll talk about a little later. So I hear my water starting to boil, but we're not quite there. And actually, if you could turn the camera, Ruby, and we'll, just so that everyone can see, or can they see, is it up?
No, not yet.
Okay. A lot of people will look at this and think that, okay, it's boiling, it's ready to start the timer, but this is actually just a simmer. If you can see that, you can see there's action going on in there. There are bubbles coming up. There's little tiny bubbles all over the lids of the jars, but this is not boiling yet. Okay, this is getting there. And we'll come back and I'll show you that once we actually are boiling. Okay, so let's see, we talked about salt. Sugar is next. Sugar is another ingredient that we use in fermenting and pickling foods. So unless the recipe calls for something different, use just plain old white granulated sugar. Sugar substitutes aren't recommended in pickles because the heat and the storage can make the flavors off, and it can also make them bitter. So again, kind of like the salt, if you want to use a sugar substitute, make sure that you're using a recipe that has been developed just for that. You don't ever want to substitute a sugar substitute for sugar like you would in baking when you're canning. And there are recipes in the publication about that. So spices, again, kind of like with fruits and vegetables, you want to make sure you're using fresh spices. That's one thing that, you know, we leave in our cabinets, and maybe we only use, you know, a certain spice a couple times a year. Make sure that you check the expiration dates on your spices, and that can make a big difference if you have old spices. So make sure it's fresh, and typically in pickling and fermenting, you want to use whole spices. For example, you'll see in most recipes, instead of black pepper, it'll call for whole peppercorns. If you are using ground spices, it can darken your pickles and make them cloudy. And again, you know, sometimes there is a bacteria that can make the liquid in your jar cloudy. So take the guesswork out and use those whole spices if you have those. But ground spices can also change the flavor. So that can be potentially undesirable. You can also put your spices in, and some of the recipes will specify this, in a little spice bag. Like if you're boiling your pickling liquid with your spices, you might put it in a little spice bag, so then you can just take it out. Let's see here, we're not quite there yet, but I hear it rolling over here. We're almost. So another ingredient is firming agents, like alum and pickling lime. Firming agents are usually not needed as long as your produce is fresh and of good quality. And actually, alum is no longer recommended to use in pickling. It used to be very common, but it's no longer recommended for safety and quality. Now, you can use lime if you really want to, but be sure that you are using food-grade lime, that it is made to be consumed by humans, and not agricultural lime that farmers put on their fields. It's not very common to find lime usually. I mean, you can buy it online, but it's not something that's common in the grocery store. But using lime can make your pickles more firm, which is good, which is what we want. But you would have to soak the cucumbers in the lime solution before pickling, and then you have to remove any excess lime, before canning. And that requires soaking and rinsing and soaking and rinsing with fresh water every time, multiple times, to make sure that you have removed any excess lime off of those pickles. Because if there is lime or on your cucumbers, I guess they're not pickles yet, if there is still lime on those cucumbers, it could potentially increase the risk of Clostridium botulinum being present in your canned food, because the lime can affect the acidity level. So again, take that guesswork out, and I wouldn't recommend using lime, but you can. That's an option. Just make sure you're doing it safely and using food grade lime. So another option that you can do is soak your cucumbers in ice water for 4 to 5 hours. So just in the refrigerator in ice water, or even on the countertop, as long as the water stays ice cold before pickling. It's much safer than lime, and it's pretty effective in making sure that your pickles are crisp after you can them. Now, I mentioned in this recipe that I'm making that pickling crisp is optional. We're almost there, not quite. It usually comes in a little jar just like this. This is pickle crisp granules. And this is something that you could use. It's just kind of like insurance to make sure that your pickles are firm. It's calcium chloride, and that's the only ingredient in here. If you're not sure with anything, always flip it over and look at the ingredients. It's calcium chloride. And there's different brands, of course, of this pickling crisp. But you can add this if you wanted to make sure that your pickles were crisp. And a lot of recipes now will say, if you want to add it, kind of like this one, if you want to add it now, and it's optional. Question?
That was the question.
That was the question. Okay, good. I read your mind. Okay, we're not quite there. It looks like it's boiling, but it's not quite there yet. So let's talk a little bit about equipment. So for making your pickling solution, and I'm not talking about your canner, okay? I'm talking about, like, I had my pickling solution back here in this little pot. You want to make sure that you use stainless steel when you are making your solution. That will prevent leaching any metals into the food, and also will prevent any pitting in the bottom of your pot. So like if you were to use aluminum or a cast iron for your pickling solution, it could potentially hit the bottom of your pot and could potentially leach some of those metals into your food. Cast iron, probably not as much of a deal, because the extra iron in your diet when you cook with cast iron can be a good thing, but we probably don't want aluminum in our diet. But also we don't want to ruin our cast iron pots either. So make sure that you're using stainless steel. Almost. Let's see. Okay, so for a crock or something that you're going to be, if you're soaking your vegetables, or if you're fermenting, especially, for each 5 pounds of vegetables you have, you'll need 1 gallon of container. Now, 1 gallon of a container is probably too small. Better to err on the side of having a bigger container, too big than what you really need. But you can use a stone crock. That's probably the most common, the most thought of, or glass. And you can also use plastic containers, but make sure that those plastic containers are food grade. You don't want to just use a storage container that you pick up at the store because it's the right size. Now, if you only have a container that is not food grade, so a storage container that you picked up at the store, or a 5-gallon bucket that you got at the hardware store, you can use that as long as you line it with a food grade plastic bag. And garbage bags are not food grade. So make sure that it is a food grade plastic bag. Okay, Ruby, if you want to switch cameras over here, we are rocking. And if you will also set a timer for 10 minutes. Actually, I'm going to check my recipe again. I never trust my memory when I am making a recipe, and I've made this recipe before, but I always like to check. Yes, it's 10 minutes in a boiling water canner. So we will let that go with the lid on, of course. I took it off just so you can see how it's rocking and rolling. You want it to be to the point where it's boiling. There is no question that this is a boil. Okay, previous to this, it was like, well, it's boiling, but it's not quite. Okay, this is moving. I mean, it is really actively boiling. So we know that is ready to process. Okay, so just make sure that whatever you're using is food grade. Okay, and that's a picture of a crock there that a lot of people think of. So when you're grinding and fermenting, you want to make sure that the vegetables are completely submerged in that liquid, at least 1 to 2 inches below the surface. And in order to keep them below the surface, you want to weigh them down with something. A dinner plate or a glass pie plate works really well. You want to make sure that it's those same materials that we talked about before. So glass, or if you had another crock, you could, set that on there. Or if you have a food grade plastic bag and you can put something heavy in it to press those vegetables down in that liquid, that works too. Just make sure that those vegetables stay down in the liquid the entire time. So whether it's 5 hours or 2 weeks, you want to make sure that they stay down the entire time. I'm going to, let's see, I think I'm going to tilt my lid just a little bit to let some of the steam escape, maybe, only because there's a little bit of liquid that's coming out, just a little there. Well, that's worse. Okay. So make sure that the vegetables stay down in liquid the entire time. Once you get your pie plate or your plate, your weights down in the liquid, something else that you can do if it's not heavy enough. So like if you have a pie plate and it's pressing them down, but they're not down 1 to 2 inches, you can put quart jars full of water with lids on, just to keep the lid from, or keep the water from spilling into your liquid. You can put those heavy quart jars on that pie plate and it'll hold it down and make those vegetables stay under the water. And then you want to cover it with a heavy towel, and that'll prevent insects or anything from getting in there, just kind of keeping it clean. Oh, one other pointer too is no matter what container you're using, whether it's a container or a food grade bag, make sure that everything is, that you have washed it with hot soapy water. So your crock and also the plate or the pie plate that you're putting on there, make sure that what you're using is clean. Okay, so let's get a little into general boiling water canning. Some of these we're going to skip through because you saw me do it live earlier. But with filling jars, and now these are pictures of jams and jellies here because I didn't have any pictures of filling pickles for this presentation. I guess I should have taken some this morning. But you want to make sure again that you are using the back end of your headspace tool and removing those bubbles and then checking the headspace. And you might have to do that a couple times because if you get the bubbles out, okay, air is released, the headspace might go down. So then you have to check the headspace again and adjust. Also, when you're canning, it's important to use plastic and not metal because similar to your pickling solution in your pot, if some metals can react with the liquid that's in your jar, and not just pickles, but anything that we're canning. And then also, if you have like a metal knife that you're putting in your jar to get the air bubbles out, you could chip the jar. So we don't want that, obviously. Okay, so for the process, and I know we're already going through the process here, but when you're canning, you want to fill your canner about half full with clean hot water. And I forgot this step where it says optional add vinegar, but you can add just white distilled vinegar right into your canner in the water. What that does, and especially if you're here in Central Kentucky, we have hard water, and hard water buildup can, or the hard water minerals can build up on the outside of your jar. It's not a safety issue, it's just a feature issue. If you can see this jar compared to this jar, it's a little cloudy, this jar is. This jar was canned with no vinegar in the water, so it just makes the jar cloudy. Not a big deal, but just something optional you can do. You want to make sure that you have a rack in the bottom of your canner, and racks come with the boiling water canner, so that's nothing extra that you have to have. And then you want to heat that water. So I talked a little bit about this, and there's a question about it, about heating that water up to about 180 degrees. We don't want it to be boiling yet, but we want to start getting it ready to get ready to boil. So once we're ready to boil, it'll go pretty quickly. So it didn't take very long once we got to that point to turn our heat on to high and to boil the water. Okay, so then you'd make your recipe, and then the process that you've seen, we'd load the canner, keeping the jars upright. And I didn't mention this, but remember when I put my headspace tool down in my canner and I had 2 inches. If I had had below 1 inch, or even if I had had right at 1 inch, I would have added some hot water. And just a tip, it's better to add hot water, because if you add cold water, that water is going to cool down just a little. It's going to take a little longer for it to boil. We want, the process to go as quick as we can, but with the safest method that we can. So we just want to be efficient with those kind of things. So it is, if you need to add water, add hot water. And I have over here, off camera, an electric kettle full of water. So if that happened, I could easily add some boiling water. Didn't have to do that because my water level was 2 inches above my jars. So as we've done, we put our lid on, we turned our heat up to high. Once it got to boiling, we start our time. So that's one thing to keep in mind. When we use the boiling water canner, we start our processing time when the water is boiling. When we're using the pressure canner, we start our time when we've reached pressure. So time starts with boiling in the boiling water canner, okay? So once this goes off, which we're probably getting close, oops, that's not the right slide. Let me skip around a little bit. We'll wait to get here. Okay, we have 2 minutes left, Ruby said. So I just want to go back to headspace really quickly. So it is the airspace that is from the top of the liquid and the product to the bottom of the jar. And it's different in different products. And it looks like half of my slide got deleted here because with pickles and fermented foods, what we're talking about today, headspace is 1/2 inch. Any kind of jams and jellies is 1/4 inch, and most fresh vegetables and meats and soups and stews and stocks are 1 inch. So, but today for pickles and fermented foods, our headspace is 1/2 inch. And you saw how we measure that. But that is the headspace. It allows the food to expand a little bit, and it is also based on depending on what you are canning. It allows for the oxygen to be pulled out of that air. That's what forms a vacuum seal. So that headspace is very important, and it's not the same on everything. I judged a county fair the other day, and a lot of people think that line, this bottom rim line, is just the fill line for anything you're canning. Now it does say on the jars, fill here, but it says for freezing. So I think that's kind of a misconception that that's the fill line. It depends on what you're canning. And in that research-based recipe that you're using, it will tell you what your headspace should be. And if you're ever not sure, just double check where you got that recipe and if there's more resources about that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about jars. With canning, you want to make sure that you're using a mason type jar. The main brands that are out there are Ball, Kerr, and Golden Harvest. There are other brands out there that are canning jars, but they're of lesser quality, okay? Again, taking the question out and using the best quality, the best methods, the safest, everything that has been researched is best. Okay, there's our timer, so pause over here. So I'm gonna reach over here and try not to get burned and turn the burner off, and I'm gonna remove the lid. Woo! And stand back here because it is really moving in there. Now, Ruby, if you had set a timer for 5 minutes, we are going to let this sit and just kind of chill out and calm down. And then we're going to take our jars out. So if you think about when we put the jars in, we had, hot jar with hot water in it. We put it in hot water, and then we got that temperature hotter. So now we're going in reverse. We're just going to cool the water down just a little bit. It's not going to be much. It's still going to be really hot, but we're just going to bring it from boiling to again, about 180 to 190 probably degrees. So it's just gonna simmer out a little bit. And it's also safe to wait so that you don't get splashed by that boiling water. But this is just the first step in the cooling process. So with the jars, you want to inspect them every year, make sure there's no nicks or cracks or scratches or anything in your jars. They are made to be used over and over and over and over again. Those cheaper, lesser quality canning jars are also made to be used over and over, but there has definitely been more breakages of those jars in my experience, and people that I know who have used those jars experience. So I would rather pay just a little bit more for a better quality jar that I know is going to hold up, it's going to seal, it's not going to break, and it's going to last me for a long time. With the lids, let's switch here. Was there a question about a jar?
Siphoning? S-I-P-H-O-N-I-N-G.
Oh, siphoning?
Mm-hmm.
Or siphoning?
Siphoning.
What's the question?
Can you talk about siphoning and common reasons it will happen? It happens in both pressure and water canning.
So are you talking about siphoning where liquid comes out of the jar?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So that's a good question. I've had personal experience with that actually. So usually when that happens, it is because there is a drastic temperature difference. So the times that I have had it happen was when I was making, it's been a couple times actually. One time I was canning venison and another time I was canning chicken stock. So both of those were in the pressure canner. So when I took the lid off and I took the jars out of the canner, once the jars hit the, out of the water into the room temperature, the liquid started to come out. And that was because it went from a hot temperature to a cool, even if it, might not be air conditioned and cool, it's still cool compared to what it was inside that canner. And that temperature change caused the liquid to squirt out, which then results in not a shelf stable product because that liquid and those particles now have compromised the seal. So between the lid and the rim of the jar, there were particles. So I'm not going to keep that jar at room temperature. So usually that's what it is. And again, that's why this step is important, is waiting the 5 minutes. And similar to when we're pressure canning, when you remove that lid, just a little insurance, wait 5 minutes, and then take your jars out. So I hope that answered your question. If you're looking for, if you have another specific question, feel free to ask that. I want to make sure that how I've explained that makes sense to you. But usually it's because of a drastic, which may not seem drastic to you, but drastic temperature difference that causes loss of liquid in your jar. Okay, so let's talk about the lids. The flat lid, which goes right on the jar, is it has to be a new lid every time, and they just come in a little box like this. There's the regular and the wide mouth, but you want to make sure you have a new one of these on your jars every time. And then the screw band, and the screw bands can be used over and over and over as long as they're not rusted or dented or damaged in any way. After you have your jars out and you're ready to store those, we recommend that you remove the screw band because moisture can get trapped under here, and then that can cause rust. And then when these are rusty, it's not recommended to use them. So you can just take those off. And we've talked about our tools and utensils a little bit. One that I used that I didn't talk about is the jar lifter. And that is that tool you see there on the right. And that's just to pull the jars in and out of the canner. We'll use that again. Actually, we'll use it right now because that's our timer. Let me move my tools over here, make a little more space here, and we will pull these jars out. So Ruby, if you want to switch camera views. And you can see, I think you'll be able to see in a minute, that the jars have kind of all squished together. And that's normal, that happens, especially when that water is so vigorously boiling. So just like when I put the jars in the canner, I am not going to tilt the jars. I'm going to keep them upright at all times, even though I know you're like me and you want to tilt the jar to get that water off of the lid. Just let it go and know that the water will either evaporate or come off of the lid after it cools. So I'm going to keep them upright, and there's definitely, you cannot prevent dripping water at this point because the water is on the lid. They look beautiful. All right, so I'm going to continue with the PowerPoint, and then I'm going to talk about the jars, okay? All right, let's see here. Oh, and just to mention, because I have it in the picture on the PowerPoint here, and actually bonus points for somebody who can put in the chat, what tool is shown here that we no longer use? It's outdated if you could say that. It's one there, I've talked about something with the lid that we no longer have to do that is not required. Did somebody get it? Yes, the lid lifter. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's this little stick here in the middle. It has a magnet on the end. And if you go to the store and you buy what they call, I think, a canning discovery kit, and it has these 4 items in it, typically it will still have that lid lifter, even though that's no longer necessary in canning. Give it to your kid and let them use it as a magnet. Okay, so we have done this step. We turned the heat off, we removed the lid, waited that 5 minutes, and now we have our jars here on the table. So if you've noticed, I've spaced them out. So there's air space that can go in between my jars. I want to make sure that there's air space that can evenly cool them down. If they're all clumped together, it'll take longer for them to cool down. And if I were to lay a towel on top of these, which is sometimes a common practice with canning, is laying a towel on top of them, I'm basically insulating those jars and I'm keeping that heat inside the jar. Okay, we don't want that. We want to have air space and we want them to cool down naturally. We don't want it to cool down fast. So I want to make sure that I don't have an air conditioner vent blowing on these, or a fan, or a window open where there's wind blowing in. We want to make sure that they're just sitting undisturbed for at least 12 hours and no more than 24. And I'll talk about the reason for that in a minute. But after that time, after 12 hours, you can test the seals. So you would just touch the top of the jar and make sure, I don't know if you heard that, but I just heard one of them pop. But you would make sure that it's sealed after they're completely cooled after 12 hours. And then at that point, you can remove the rim, and you may need to wipe off the screw part of the jar here. Sometimes excess moisture can be present around there, especially after boiling water canning. So just wipe that off, wipe the jar off, clean it up if you need to, and then date it and label it with what it is, because if you think you'll remember, you probably won't. And then you can store it. You can have your harvest in the jar and store it on a shelf or in your cabinet, somewhere that is a cool, dry place. We recommend, for best quality, flavor and nutrient quality of canned food, that you eat it within about a year, but 2 years, it'll be fine. And even longer than that, as long as you have followed a research-based recipe and methods properly, it will be safe for quite some time. But if you do have a jar that you press it and it sounds like that, it has that little pop, you know that it's not sealed. That jar is not going to be safe at shelf, at room temperature. So there's a couple things you can do, kind of like this jar over here, that's going to be my experiment that I have not processed, that I'm just going to put in the refrigerator and maybe check it in a week or so. you can take that unsealed jar, put it in the refrigerator, and just eat that one first, which is normally what I do, especially if it's just one jar. I'll just put it in the refrigerator, and that'll be what I'll eat for dinner or for a snack later. But if you have canned a lot of pickles and you have several of them that didn't seal, first you might check the jar, take the ring and the lid off, check and make sure there's not a nick in the top of your jar rim, or that there's not something wrong with the flat lid. And you can reprocess those if you want. And that's why we say check it after 12, but before 24. Because if you do have jars that did not seal, you can reprocess them, but you have to do it before the 24-hour mark. So if I have lids that haven't sealed, I need to reprocess them before 2:30 tomorrow. So I'll need to check them in the morning to make sure that they've sealed. So if you do want to reprocess your jars, you will need a new flat lid, because technically this lid, well, these lids, not this one, has already been through the canning process. It has already been heated and cooled to room temperature. It has already been used. Even though it didn't seal, you need to have a new lid. So the steps will be the same. You'll wipe the rim, put your new clean washed lid on, and then you'll put your screw band on, and the process is the same. Like I said, unless I have multiple jars that didn't seal, and or if I'm going to be canning more the next day that I can just add them in with the rest of the pickles I'm making, I don't think it's worth it to reprocess, but you certainly can. Totally up to you. But you would still follow the recipe and through that step. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about resources, because you've heard me talk a lot about research-based methods. So the first resource, of course, is all of our publications that we have through the University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension Service. And you have those in your email. And again, if you want those printed copies, I'd be glad to print those for you, or you can contact your extension office. Another really good resource is the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension Service. And the reason why, out of all the other states' extension services, we recommend theirs is because they house the National Center for Home Food Preservation. So this national center that is housed there does testing and research of all these recipes, of all these methods over the years. You know, it's the latest and greatest research that we know is safe to use and to follow. So all of our information from our publications from the university, that information basically comes from the National Center for Home Food Preservation at UGA. They are doing the research, passing it down to the extension services in the state, and then we are putting the information together to pass out to you to be able to utilize. So there are a lot of resources on their website. You can Google UGA canning, and the National Center for Home Food Preservation will come up. They also have a book that's called So Easy to Preserve, and it has lots more recipes and troubleshooting tips in there as well. That's available to purchase from Georgia. And then another reputable resource is Fresh Preserving. Fresh Preserving is the name of the company that owns the Ball and Kerr brands, and I've mentioned those a couple times. But on their website, they have lots of recipes and information about not only canning, and actually the other resources are the same, not only canning, but all food preservation methods. In addition to their website, they have several books. You may be familiar with the Ball Blue book. That is one of their original resources for recipes, for canning. And then they have lots of other books as well that are available with recipes and methods and just, you know, little tips and information. But I would just caution you, in this age of information on the internet, on the World Wide Web out there, I would caution you with some of the recipes that are out there. There are lots of recipes out there. There are lots of good-hearted people who want to teach others to can, who might not be doing things the safest way. So now that you know what you know after taking this class, when you come across things out there, I hope that you will question it. Just question, where is this information coming from? Is it research-based? If it's someone who's saying, don't worry about what they say to do, I've been doing this for years and no one has ever died. Well, I mean, that's good, but I don't want to chance that. I'm not going to put that risk when I'm canning for me or my family. So I hope that you take the information and just be knowledgeable about what information is out there. But with these 3 resources, this is all the information that you need for canning recipes. Now, that being said, if you ever come across a recipe that you are not sure where it came from, or if you have a recipe that has been handed down, maybe from your great aunt, passed down in the family, I would be glad to look at that recipe. I have a resource that I can send it to, and they can analyze it and let you know if that recipe is safe, or maybe you need to add some vinegar or processing time, etc. So just know that as the Cooperative Extension Service, we are here as a resource for you. So with that, in closing, are there any questions from you all? Oh, let's see, there is one. Oh, thanks, Tamra. All right, well, just know that, especially now that we are really in the thick of harvest season and canning season, that if you ever have any questions, you have my contact information. I'm always a resource for you, as well as your local extension agent. So I hope that you all enjoyed the presentation, and I'll see you next time.